They say the snow remembers everything it buries. That morning, it gave Gideon Hale a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Leave a stranger to the cold, or reopen wounds the war never truly closed. Before we slip into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Snow lay heavy across the land that morning, the kind of deep, sound-swallowing white that shrank the world and pressed silence into every corner. Gideon Hale felt the familiar tight pull in his ruined leg the moment he stepped out of his cabin, pain blooming sharp and slow as the cold bit through wool and bone. He adjusted his coat around his shoulders, breathing out a long plume of frost that drifted, thinned, and vanished. Old habits guided his eyes, as they always had. He checked the barn roof for collapse, the fence line for breaks, the tree line beyond the path for movement that didn't belong. War taught him that quiet was never empty. It only waited. He moved toward the creek with a steady, practiced pace, each step measured, each breath controlled. The sun had barely climbed, leaving the forest washed in pale blue shadow. Today, the limp showed more clearly. The cold had found the bullet wound and tightened around it like a fist. Halfway down the narrow slope, Gideon paused, pressing a gloved hand against his thigh until the spike dulled enough to move again. The creek ran beneath a thin shell of ice, dark water shifting slowly below like something alive and watching. He started to kneel to check the trap he'd set the night before when something farther down the bank caught his eye. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't driftwood. It was a human body, half buried in snow. His pulse jumped once, sharp and controlled. Gideon didn't rush. He forced himself to scan the trees first, turning slightly, listening for the wrong kind of quiet. Only the wind moved, whispering through bare branches. Step by careful step he approached, until the shape resolved into a young woman. Patchy frost clung to her clothing. Long black hair spilled across the snow, stiff with ice. Beneath it, beaded leather showed through in muted color. Her skin was drained pale, lips split and dry. Her wrists were raw and swollen, skin torn, as if rope had bitten into them for days. Gideon crouched beside her with a low grunt. His chest tightened, not with panic, but with the weight of memory. Too many bodies. Too many fields after battles that smelled like iron and snow. He shoved it down and leaned close enough to watch her breath. It was there, barely, uneven, fragile, alive, but not by much. He touched her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" No answer. Her eyelids fluttered but never opened. Her body shuddered once. A sharp, involuntary tremor pulled from cold more than fear. Urgency climbed his spine. If he left her to fetch help, she wouldn't survive the hour. There was no one else within miles. It was only him. Gideon slid his arms beneath her, careful to support her head and back. She sagged against him, lighter than she should have been. Starvation, cold, or both. As he stood, pain flared hard enough to draw his teeth together. He didn't stop. He adjusted his grip, keeping her head from falling back, and started up the slope. Snow broke beneath his boots in a slow, heavy rhythm. Her hair brushed his coat, brittle with ice. She made a faint sound, breath catching against pain, but her eyes stayed closed. He shifted her closer, angling his body to shield her from the wind. By the time he reached the cabin, sweat slicked the back of his neck despite the cold. He kicked the door open and stepped inside, shutting it with a solid thud. The stove's warmth hadn't reached the far corners yet, but it was enough to keep death at bay. He laid her gently on the bed, easing her down until her head rested on the worn pillow. Her fingers curled weakly. One brushed his sleeve and he froze, heart hitching, but the hand fell limp again. Gideon moved fast after that. He fed the stove until the flames climbed. He filled a basin with warm water and set it near the bed. He drew the quilt over her inch by inch, watching her body react. When warmth touched her skin, she shivered violently, pain rippling through her, then slowly settled. He sank into the single chair and watched her, letting the tension bleed from his shoulders. Fire crackled softly. Her breathing rasped, thin but steady. Silence filled the space between them. He didn't know her name. He didn't know who had hurt her, or if someone would come looking. But leaving her in the snow wasn't something he could do anymore. Not after the war. Not after learning what hesitation cost. He rubbed the stiff muscle in his leg. "You're safe here," he muttered, though she couldn't hear him. He sharpened his knife in slow, deliberate strokes, eyes never fully leaving her. She didn't move again, but her breath held on. And for the first time in months, Gideon didn't feel completely alone. That unsettled him more than he liked. Late morning light crept through the small window in thin bands, warming only where it touched. The rest of the cabin stayed cold, stubborn. Gideon sat by the wood box, sorting dry pieces when he heard it. A shift behind him, a blanket rustling, a sharp inhale dragged from sleep and pain. He turned slowly, careful not to startle her. The Apache woman was awake. She lay stiff beneath the quilt, shoulders raised. Breath caught halfway between a gasp and a warning. Her dark eyes scanned the ceiling, the walls, every corner, before locking on him. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She looked at him the way people look when they expect the next moment to hurt. Gideon stayed seated, hands resting openly on his knees. "You're in my cabin," he said quietly. "Found you by the creek yesterday." Her gaze snapped to the door, measuring distance, testing her body. He saw it all. "You're safe here," he added, steady and plain. She didn't relax, her fingers tightened in the quilt, knuckles whitening. Her breathing turned uneven as her eyes catalogued the room. The chair, the boots, the rifle leaning against the wall. Her gaze lingered there longest. Gideon moved toward the stove slowly, adjusting the kettle so the water stayed warm. He stood with care. "There's water," he said, nodding toward the bowl. "Still warm." She watched it, then him, distrust written in every line of her face. He stepped back, giving her space. "Drink when you're ready." Time stretched. Finally, she pushed herself upright, keeping the quilt between them like armor. Her hand trembled as she lifted the bowl. When warm water touched her lips, her eyes closed briefly, not in comfort but shock. She drank in small sips, stopping halfway, saving the rest. Gideon pulled on his coat and unlatched the door, letting cold spill in as he stepped outside, leaving it slightly open on purpose. If she chose to run, he wouldn't cage her. Snow softened under the sun as he split wood, each swing careful, controlled. Inside, she watched from the doorway, eyes tracking him. When he returned, she didn't retreat. He set the wood down and nodded toward the stove. "Keeps the cold off." She didn't answer, but she stayed, and that small choice settled heavier than words ever could. By nightfall, the storm finally loosened its grip. The wind softened, and snow fell slower, quieter, as if the land itself was catching its breath. Inside the cabin, firelight flickered across the walls, turning rough wood into something almost gentle. Gideon Hale sat at the table, repairing a leather strap with steady hands, though the ache in his leg pulsed with every shift of weight. Across the room, the Apache woman sat near the stove, wrapped in the wool cloak, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. She spoke again that night. Only one word, rough and low, as if pulled from somewhere deep. "Noah." Gideon looked up slowly. "Your name?" She nodded once. Nothing more, but it was enough. Her name was a bridge, fragile but real. Days passed in quiet rhythm. Snow still ruled the land, but the cabin grew warmer, steadier. Noah's strength returned in small, stubborn pieces. Color came back to her cheeks. Her steps grew firmer. She helped without being asked, stacking wood, rinsing cups, mending small tears with practiced fingers. She never told him what had been done to her, and Gideon never asked. Some stories demanded silence more than answers. On the 7th morning, the sky cleared fully for the first time. Blue stretched wide and endless above the trees. Noah stood at the doorway, looking out at the open land, her cloak pulled tight, her hair braided neatly again. Gideon watched from behind, understanding before she said anything. "I will go," she said quietly. He nodded. "I figured you would." She turned to him then, studying his face the way she had that first day, but now without fear, only thought. She reached out and pressed something into his palm. A small beaded strip, worn smooth with time. Not payment, not a token, a memory, a promise that this moment had mattered. "For saving me," she said. Gideon closed his fingers around it. "You saved yourself," he replied. She hesitated at the threshold, then leaned forward and pressed her forehead briefly to his shoulder. The contact was light, deliberate, and gone almost before it registered. Then she stepped into the snow and began walking toward the trees, her figure slowly blending into the white and shadow. Gideon stood there long after she disappeared, the cold biting his face, his leg aching, his chest heavier and lighter all at once. He returned inside, eventually stoked the fire, and sat alone, but not empty. The cabin felt different now, less like a place to wait out the years, more like a place something had passed through and left a mark behind. Outside, the creek continued to run beneath the ice, and somewhere beyond the trees, a woman walked forward, alive. And Gideon Hale, for the first time since the war, believed that was enough.